So my name is Mary Juetten, and I'm the founder and CEO of Traklight. Traklight helps entrepreneurs identify and protect their intellectual property. We have like a TurboTax for IP, and you can come down to our booth and see us at any time. We're down right on the left-hand side down there. But what I wanted to talk to you about today, and Sunny kind of set it up for me, is what about crowdfunding and why do we care when we're entrepreneurs trying to get a lot of things done? Our world is crazy. You start up, you need funding, it's total chaos. So the last thing that you want to think about is your intellectual property. You really need to, though, because that innovation capture, while it's really hard, it's really important. For those of you who have companies that are seeking funding, even crowdfunding, you've got a valuation. Your valuation is somewhere from $1 to maybe $20 million, whatever it is. If you look at your balance sheet, I can guarantee you, like our balance sheet, we've got a negative balance sheet. So you don't have any hard assets. You really don't have, you don't have a restaurant, you don't have a, bricks and mortar type business. So you have intangible assets. A lot of those intangible assets are your brand, your reputation, your software code, all of these things that you're not putting on your balance sheet. If you don't, from the very beginning, protect those, you can lose them. So what I'm going to talk about today is how you practice safe crowdfunding, which you have to start on the right track. What that means is that at the very beginning, whether you are doing a crowdfunding campaign, whether you're doing a pitch or a business plan, this applies to all the funding that you're going to do. You need to identify and protect your IP. You need to make sure that when you're crowdfunding, you pick a great platform. Like Sunny was just talking about, there can be fulfillment issues. So you need to make sure you're picking the right platform. Then you're going to build your social capital. And while you're building your social capital and creating a pitch, you can very well infringe on other people's intellectual property. So I realize I'm in San Francisco and everyone knows what a patent is, but not everyone remembers about the importance of your copyright or your trademark. Your trademark is your brand. It's your guarantee to the consumer that if they open a bottle of Coke, they are only going to get Coca-Cola coming out of it, not Pepsi, not the store brand. A patent, though, is only the right to make what the piece that you're making. And we find that entrepreneurs often focus only on a patent. And what often happens is you think, I'm not a tech company, I don't have a patent, or I am a tech company, but I'm in software and I'm not going to bother with a patent, or you get your patents and you think you're done with your intellectual property. Trade secrets are often more than 75% of intellectual property. So it's really important that you figure those out up front. One of the big common misconceptions that we're trying to address is that people feel that if they write a check, they own whatever they've bought. And that is not the case. You have to read. There's one theme from today is that you have to read. You have to read your contracts. You have to make sure that if you're paying a web designer to do your website, at the end of the day, you own everything that that web developer has done. Same thing with source code. Source code adds another little complexity because there's been some, the whole open source, copyleft type movement. It's really important to make sure that whoever is working with your open source code is reading that code. For those of you who might not have heard, the Obama healthcare site ended up violating copyright. They used open source code, which was perfectly acceptable, except they didn't copy over the attribution. So often for copyright, it's as simple as reading what the permissions are and following those. Okay, so our 5 steps. You need to identify your IP before you can protect it. And there is no one in this room that has a company that doesn't have intellectual property. Oops, sorry. As far as protecting it, trade secrets, you can only protect them by keeping them secret. Everything else you need to properly register, and it is very important to try not to wait to register some of these things. There's been lots of cases where people are like, yeah, I'll get to that trademark, or oh yeah, I'll get to that. Meanwhile, someone else can start using it, and if they use it first, they have what's called common law trademark, and then you're kind of stuck. So make sure that you have a plan from the very beginning. Okay, so this is where I wanted to spend a little bit of time. When you are picking your platform for crowdfunding, you have the typical rewards-based crowdfunding. We're partners with Indiegogo here. We're very happy to be partners with Indiegogo. They really believe in education around this issue. So when people phone up their specialists and ask questions about IP, they refer them to us. You're putting, and you have to put, Kickstarter came up with an article in the fall of 2012 saying, Kickstarter's not a store. We want to have exactly how your product works. You can't just put a picture of a prototype any longer. So you have how that, whatever you've done, works right online. So to use Sunny as an example, when his product went up on Indiegogo, he has to have had all of his patents in place. In the US, your patent only applies in the US. So if you go and you put something out on these global platforms, Indiegogo, Kickstarter, you're basically showing the world how your product works. If you don't have the proper patents in place and a plan, you can actually lose any rights to patent around the world. And in the US, you can start a one-year clock ticking. So that is why that's our whole mantra around practice safe crowdfunding is you need to be safe. To be safe, you have to identify first, then protect. So many of you might have heard of the Jobs Act with the equity-based type crowdfunding, which is not legal yet on a federal level, but is legal in some states. So with that type of crowdfunding, you're going to be required to put your entire business plan online according to the Jobs Act. The recent rules that came out talk about putting a business description online. Then we have some of these other sites, AngelList, Lending Club, MicroVentures, who's here at this conference also. And these type of crowdfunding platforms require some disclosure, but the good part about that is it's not necessarily public. So as far as the equity crowdfunding, it's going to be the same type of steps that you have to do for regular financing sources. So the idea is if you're thinking of doing the equity crowdfunding, or if you live in a state where it's legal now to do it within your state, it's going to be the same steps as any other crowdfunding. This is what Sunny alluded to. We've worked with a bunch of different companies in terms of helping them with their crowdfunding campaigns. And you really need to, again, read, because with Kickstarter, it's all or nothing. And then with Indiegogo, they offer you the option of doing, if you raise, whatever you raise, you keep that amount less a bigger percentage commission, or you can do all or nothing also. So you really need to decide, okay, do I really need all of this money to fulfill what I've been, what I've put out there as rewards? The idea of crowdfunding is not necessarily just to raise the money. It's also a great market validation. So if you're doing it because you want to raise money for a cause, that's one thing. But if you're doing it like Pebble Watch, I mean, they validated the need for, they validated that the world wanted and needed what they were producing. But they also created a very large fulfillment problem, much like Sunny was referring to. It was a lot of watches. So you need to be realistic in what you're going to raise, but you also need to really, really understand your fulfillment. So don't enter into something on Indiegogo where you're going to be committed to costs of like $100,000 and then you only raise 50, but you've committed to creating this product. So it's something that happens, and the Indiegogo is great. They have a lot of online support and help for this type of, for when you're planning your campaign. Okay, raising social capital, incredibly important. Social capital is not just social media, and part of this is that you have to start well before you ever launch your campaign, like 2 months at least before in building your social capital. Because crowdfunding originally came out of the whole donations, and it's like charitable giving. When you do a charitable donation campaign, whoever's running that campaign makes sure they have about 30% of their of the funds they want to raise committed. So that commitment is really, really important. So it's not about getting 50,000 Twitter followers that are, that you buy and aren't really engaged. It's crowdfunding for a reason. You're supposed to find your crowd. So there are so many different platforms out there in terms of, you can find whatever niche, but that's where you need to be. You need to be with your crowd. Okay, so your content is really important and you need to get it done way before. But this is where you can get in trouble from an intellectual property perspective. There's been campaigns that have gone on where people have raised money. There was one campaign where someone raised $10,000 on Kickstarter. Great. A lot of work goes into raising $10,000. However, they got an $8,000 fine for using images incorrectly. So when you're going out there and creating your pitch, it's not just about infringing on someone else's patent. A lot of it is simple stuff. It's going out there and looking for images, music, whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that you look at the permissions and you need to make sure that you don't use somebody else's IP. I was on a panel up in Seattle and we were talking with a guy who had done a very successful Kickstarter campaign. He did it for market validation, but when he went to put together his video, he went out and he paid $165 to license the music that went with that video. That was a lot better than a $5,000 fine if you just go out and grab a clip, because it's a very common misconception. You can't just take a clip and not pay for it. There's no 2-second rule, 3-second rule. It's not like throwing something on the ground. There's no rules like that. And when you're out on the internet, just because you don't see a C, the copyright C, it doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't have a license for that. My analogy is, if you walked outside and you saw a bike and there was no lock, it doesn't mean you can just take that bike. It's the same thing. So if you didn't originally create whatever that work is and have permission from the people who are involved in creating that work to use it, then you can't just use it. Well, you could, but then you run the risk of getting fined. And the reason I bring up with the people that are, you need permission. I can't just take a picture of all of you and then use it. It's my picture, but you didn't consent to me using that. So this, there was an interesting, I'm sure most of you have heard of the dumb Starbucks parody, or alleged parody. So with dumb Starbucks, people went and they started taking pictures and putting them on Instagram. And so it's fine if it's just, you're just doing your little personal use, but if you were trying to use that to actually generate money, people can come back at you because you're not, I don't want to be in your picture and be used to, with drinking the dumb Starbucks cup. Coffee to be used for you to make money. So the big lesson here today with, besides identifying and protecting your IP, is to make sure that you read the licenses. CreativeCommons.org has a great set of licenses. There are tons of free music, free pictures, all of those sites. They just are usually looking for attribution. So you need to read the new, whatever the nuance is at the bottom. Because for example, you'll get permissions that will say, you can use this only if it's not for commercial use. And putting it on your blog is for commercial use. We have some cartoons that we think are funny because they're intellectual property cartoons, but we're kind of nerdy. So those cartoons, we license them and we use them in presentations, but we don't use them in presentations that go on the internet because that's what the license says. If we don't pay attention to that, we'll get a large fine. So when you're crowdfunding, pitching, doing whatever, make sure that you go and find images that you can use safely. This image here comes from a site called Unsplash. Every week they send me 10 really cool pictures. So we have all of this information listed on our site. We have something called the IP Cloud, which is a list of all the resources that startups can use. It's centered around intellectual property, but it's also got a lot of information there on startup lawyers, emerging ventures, where you can get some free forms. And so for launch, we are giving people 25% off our existing software, which is like a TurboTax for IP that will help you identify your intellectual property, gives you a plan, and you get that for a whole year to update. And we're about to launch our new version, which is not launching today, but when we do that, you'll be automatically upgraded to that. So happy to take any questions with the time that I have left, and thank you for listening.
Questions, anyone? Can raise your hand. What's the one biggest mistake that you see, Mary? I mean, you went through a lot of things about attribution, thinking about your patents ahead of time, both from not infringing someone else's IP, also protecting your kind of company as it's in development. Have you seen a really worst case scenario that you can use as a scare tactic?
Well, I'd say there's 3. The worst one I saw was a woman who paid $100,000 for software and then realized at the end she didn't actually own the source code because she didn't read the agreement properly. She didn't take the time to do that, and so she had to pay another $25,000 to obtain the source code. So that was one of the worst. Another was somebody who really was laser focused on the patent side, which was great because he was doing a Kickstarter campaign, but he totally ignored trademark. And then when he came out, after he'd done his packaging, it's a hardware product, done the packaging, done the website, done the marketing material, he's infringing on a very large company's trademark. So that focus on the patents left him, throwing away a pile of money. And the third one was a restaurant that waited and waited to save a few dollars with the USPTO because they didn't want to say, we're going to file this for in use. So it was their name. So they created their signage and their menus and on and on. And then another restaurant opened up, this is a story from Phoenix, opened up, same name. They started using it, so they were using it in commerce. And so it's simple things, and no disrespect to the lawyers in the audience, but a lot of this is not legal advice, it's just good business advice. Read your contracts, get contracts, don't do things on a handshake.